your voice really does carry a lot of weight when we are having these community meetings, because all of those testimonies are sent to the boards. They're sent to the city council hearings. They're sent to the mayor's office. And the more pressure the elected officials get, the more they're gonna listen to you, because they're gonna realize it is something the community cares about, and it's not just something they're gonna be able to check off. Because at the end of the day, elected officials have a job to do. And if they don't do the job right, they know they won't get reelected.
Good evening. I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program. This is the second program in our fall 2022, spring 2023 virtual lecture series, Our Issues, Our Voices, Our Votes, Youth Civic Participation Today. This evening's program, Lighting the Fire, What Motivates Young Activists, will explore what brings young people to the streets, engage in advocacy, and go to the voting booth. Widespread disillusionment with that establishment politics and skepticism about power to make change, increasing their voices heard. Some tactics are familiar and traditional, but some tactics are innovative and fresh. This evening, we will sit down with an amazing group of young leaders to hear their stories, what motivates them to action, and to explore some of the tactics and strategies that are branding with their unique generational stamp. This series is a collaboration among Ford Hall Forum, the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University, the Washington Center, and GBH Forum Network. I'd also like to thank the Lowell Institute for their generous funding, which makes programs like this possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Christina Coolidge, who is this evening's moderator and one of the visionaries behind this series. Christina is a member of the faculty of the Political Science and Human Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University. Christina?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to all of our panelists for, number one, saying yes and giving up some of your time. I know you are all busy in advance of midterms, given the topic that we asked you to come and talk about. And thank you also to our audience for coming here for the second episode of our year-long series that examines youth civic participation, which is not limited, of course, just to voting. And that really is the heart of the discussion that I'd like to have tonight with our amazing panel. So without any further ado, I will give a quick introduction to each of the panelists and we'll get right into it. So we have Brianna Sia from Generation Voter, Sasha Goodfriend, Amara Ifajay, Enrique Pepin, who is also an alum of Suffolk. I've got to give a shout out there, and our moderator, Aparna Mukherjee. So Aparna, take it away.
Thank you, Christina. I'm thrilled, as I think everyone on this Zoom is, to hear from the voices of people who are actually doing the work. I'm, as someone who's worked as a journalist covering city halls and technology, and then actually being placed in Los Angeles City Hall. Hello from Hollywood, that's where I'm zooming in from today. I really am thrilled by the idea that the people who are most in tune with the question that all of us have in mind, which is how do we make sure the youth vote turns out, that we have the people who are actually doing the work on social media, on the streets, in so many different forums. And I will say that the part that I really love about what I've learned about our panelists and the work that they do is that they bring a lot of feeling to it. So I don't normally wear a dress with hearts, but I feel like wearing my heart on my sleeve and saying that so much of this is about how we show up with feeling. So I want to start, and I'm going to start with Bree, with a question of how you arrived at this form of activism, what really motivates you, and what you find most empowering about right now.
Great. Thank you so much for having me for this discussion. Again, my name is Bree, and I'm the executive director and founder of Generation Vote. We are the only national youth-led movement organization that has created a multi-year vision for how our generation can make electoral justice a major priority and fight for our right to vote across the country. So in terms of how I arrived to this work, I first got involved in the fight for voting rights when I was a student at a public university in upstate New York, SUNY Binghamton. And this was right around the 2016 election. In 2015 and 2016, I led a super grassroots youth-led campaign to help elect progressives that were running for office all the way from Congress down to county executive in my community around Binghamton University. And we were training young people on how to authentically engage in the political process, such as doing student opinion research, understanding what issues young people cared about, and connecting that back to the people that were running for office in our communities. This was all in the context of the 2016 presidential election, where a lot of my friends were also being activated for the first time and engaging in the electoral process. And I remember distinctly the election night of 2016, where a lot of the candidates that I was working with and that the young people I was supporting were winning. When we saw the results on the national level of where our country was headed, we went from celebrating to crying by the end of the night. And I remember waking up the next day, and my friends and I all looked around to each other and we said, we can't stop fighting now. We need to continue educating our friends and our peers about the importance of engaging in elections and in the electoral process. And it was out of that movement that Generation Vote was born, where we were going around New York State at the time, starting chapters, getting other young people plugged into the political process and campaigns. But while we were doing that work, a lot of young people were calling us and saying that they want to get involved in elections, but they didn't know how to navigate the voter registration process, let alone overcome a lot of New York's electoral voting laws. And it was within that first year of creating Generation Vote that our students voted to unite together and create the first youth-led student voting rights campaign in New York State to really tackle the systemic issues that a lot of young folks were engaged in when they were even trying to get involved in the process. And so that's how Generation Vote became all in on voting rights work, and happy to talk more about that. And really excited for the conversation, since 2022 is a critical year. I'm calling y'all from Arizona, which is right now a battleground state for the midterm elections. So appreciate today's space.
Thank you, Bree, both for all the work you're doing, but everything you're bringing to this conversation. I'm going to pull Enrique in next as someone who is actually working within the systems that you're working on, really supporting with this youth voter turnout. Please tell us what brought you to the roles you've had, including talking about the Latino caucus.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's such a pleasure to be able to speak to the audience and be amongst this amazing panel. I am currently the Director of Neighborhood Services under the leadership of Mayor Michelle Wu here in the city of Boston. And I got here because when I was about 8 years old, my family and I lived in the public housing facilities in Charlestown. And I remember very distinctly former Mayor Menino come into the community to talk about a new police station being built and a new community center being built. And he was speaking about the great resources that we were going to be able to get and that we were going to be able to use that space. And from that day on, I said, I want to be part of local government, because I was able to see the direct impact that government at such a local level, talking about the mayors, but more specifically, the district city councilors, can really have on our families, on us, and the future generations to come. Hence why I also got involved in the Young Democrats of Massachusetts Latino Caucus. My parents are from the Dominican Republic, and I was born here, but I'm very much proud to be considered a Dominican American. When I think about the Dominican community and the Latino community and everyone in general, I think about what are the gaps between the communities and city government? Where are we lacking communication to ensure that the resources may or may not be getting to these families? So I've taken it upon myself throughout the past 10 years that I've been involved in local government to make sure that, one, our families know about the resources, know how to obtain them, but also how to use them. And that's why I feel like I'm in a great spot here at Neighborhood Services, because that is exactly what we do here. I've been here for the past 10 months, and I can proudly say that we've been coming up with all kinds of initiatives, such as Field Fridays, 311 app trainings, community meetings, budget listening sessions, to make sure that our community understands what exactly city government can do for them and how they can strengthen their own lives by using the resources that honestly they pay for. So I'll let it go there, and I'll go into more details later on in the night. But thank you so much.
Enrique, I'm looking forward to talking about the power of public comment and meetings and listening sessions. And I want to turn to Amara, who really is bringing, in some ways, the outsider's perspective as an activist, as someone who's representing a state that is small but mighty in terms of her work. Amara, please tell us more about what brought you here into this moment that is so important politically and in terms of civic engagement.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Aparna. I'm so grateful to be here and for the opportunity to serve on this panel. So I am a student, first and foremost. I go to school here in Boston at Northeastern University, and I study political science and environmental studies. I am really grateful that I share my time as the Director of Policy for the Maine Environmental Education Association. And this is a nonprofit which really works to connect folks across the state of Maine to powerful outdoor learning opportunities for our youth. And I think my first experiences with the natural world is actually what compelled me to be engaged in grassroots and policy work. I actually grew up in the DC metro area. So I grew up in Hyattsville, which is like 6 miles outside of DC. And I remembered I had some really deep passions for the outdoors. We have this really big oak tree, and my grandfather, he loves to farm. He's 86 and he still farms till this day. And I would remember just sitting in that tree and kind of watching him and keeping him company there. And my passions for the environment and really a lack of opportunity to explore those passions due to my socioeconomic status, my race, and my gender identity allowed me to not only want to seek out those learning opportunities for myself, but be a part of policy and decision points that allow for other youth to be able to explore their passions for the environment. So I've since found myself in environmental education, specifically environmental education policy, to ensure that all youth in Maine and beyond have powerful environmental learning opportunities. So that has been what has brought me to this work, what is sustaining me in this work. And I'm looking forward to sharing more about that during our conversation.
Thanks. That brings us to our final panelist, Sasha, good friend, who I think is really bringing this perspective that is cross-generational, is talking about both insider and outsider, and the advocacy that really, in terms of Occupy movements, in terms of what's going on at City Hall right now, and really making sure that LGBTQ issues are at the forefront and really something that we're talking about actively. Sasha, please tell us, how did you get here and why?
Thank you, Aparna. And also, I just want to add my chorus to the appreciation of these panelists. I am also fangirling, listening to everyone else talk, and I'm so grateful for this forum. So I want to say that first and foremost. I think I also realized I might be the oldest person on this panel, though age is, just a number. But I was in college, just to put it in perspective, 10 years ago at Boston University. And I was a student activist working at the time to respond to the needs of my peers, which was to open up a rape crisis center on campus at Boston University. There was none. There were 2 crisis counselors for a 60,000 person campus. This was not a new issue, but it was an experience where I got to see how organizing worked and was successful. Within 6 months, after building allyships across the university and putting together a proposal with research from peer institutions, and meeting with the administration, they within that following fall opened up a center that then existed for the second half of my student career. And that showed me what systemic change was. And that was what I wanted to do when I graduated. But when I graduated in 2014, I realized that hiring a protester wasn't really popular in a lot of organizations. And I also realized that I didn't really know anything about policy on the local city or state level. Even though I had been studying international relations and I had done Model UN, it wasn't local. And I had been in Boston for 4 years. And also none of my friends really had relationships with their city council. We didn't see ourselves reflected in our legislature because there aren't many people our age that look like us. And when I graduated college, I started volunteering with Mass Now, the Massachusetts chapter of the National Organization for Women, and also the Massachusetts Commission on LGBTQ Youth. These are both organizations that do gender and sexuality policy, both through the legislature and also through working with agencies. And I've had a lot of fun being able to teach myself how some of the issues I was fighting for in college are issues that we can also fight for on the state level to create systemic change for everyone. So in 2014 to 16, we worked on a bill to make a pay equity bill at Mass Now that then became the most comprehensive pay equity legislation in the country because it banned employers from using salary history to determine pay. And right now we're working on not a new issue, period poverty, but we are the first people to go to the State House and talk about periods ever in this state's 400-something year history. And we're working on a bill to make products free in all schools, prisons, and shelters. And this is, similar work to what I was doing in college, but an opportunity for Massachusetts to also create policy that can then be replicated across the country as well.
Sasha, the fact that anyone who's in Boston now can go to City Hall Plaza and see something, could you tell us really quickly about that period poverty project and what someone might see?
So right now, if you're in the Boston, you all are so close at Suffolk University, so you have to go to City Hall. There's a period art pop-up show. It's on the 3rd floor mezzanine. So when you walk in the entrance, there's a big brick staircase, and that's what you go up. And we have art from over 25 different artists across the Boston area, photos, collages, drawings, paintings, videos with a QR code. And it's a really fun, artivism way to get people talking about an issue that is hard to talk about, like periods, because you can't pass policy about issues you can't talk about. And so that's the biggest barrier that we face with period poverty, the stigma. And this is a way to disrupt it and also add an opportunity to celebrate periods and menstruation too.
What I love about this is it points to a theme that's really emerging in this, which is how do you see yourself, whether it's an elected office or as an advocate or as an activist? And as someone, having spoken of age, as someone who graduated in the last century, not as recently as anyone on the panel, one of the most fantastic things is that you're having a conversation that goes across borders, whether they're state or national, international. And I know that this question mark of how social media has really made that conversation a global one, even as you're working locally. I was wondering if everyone can take a stab at this. I'm going to start with Enrique, in part because of the conversation about how to better represent democratic voice and traditionally underserved, underrepresented neighborhoods, and how your work kind of speaks to that.
I realized that I don't need nobody needs a title to do advocacy work, to ensure that we're helping people have a better life. I used to think that I needed to go to law school. I needed to be called a congressman to be able to implement change. But that is obviously years of stereotypes of, oh, these are the people that make change. But I think that in this panel, what you can see is that we are change. And Amara, Bree, Sasha, you are all different examples of what change can mean. Rather it's engaging youth voting, rather it's bringing attention to periods at the State House, rather it's, myself in helping the community understand city services. So the way that I see myself is being a bridge between understanding city government and the people of Boston. And I think that in itself is an example of advocacy, because if people like us do not exist, then there is no progress. Doesn't matter if you're working inside City Hall or as an advocate, life will become stagnant. And that is the beauty of the word progress or democracy or just involvement or engagement, because it doesn't matter who you are, as long as you're doing some sort of active work, no matter how old you are informing others, you are helping one another have a better life. And that's what I think. That's what I see myself as.
Bree, do you think that as we talk about getting involved, the skepticism, maybe even suspicion that a lot of communities have is a barrier that you find optimism or pessimism around when it comes to talking about being engaged? And as Enrique is saying, you are the change. How do you convince others of that belief?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hear this often, right? Where folks know that young people, I talk to my friends and I hear it in their voices when I say, oh, go vote. And they're like, oh, my vote doesn't matter. Or what has really changed underneath the Biden administration versus Trump? And I think when folks hear that, they automatically assume, oh, young people are just apathetic, right? But what I think is really important is to understand, and as an advocate, you have to recognize that disillusionment comes from a real place. And when I hear that, I say, yes, you're right. These institutions, these systems were not built for people that look like me. I'm a Thai, Korean, Chinese American voting rights advocate. It's all just about 100 years ago or so, people like me got the right to vote. But actually, less than 100 years ago, for Asian women in this country. And so, when I hear those concerns about the lack of trust in our democratic institutions, I think it's important that advocates recognize that that's coming from a real place, because these systems were never designed to reflect our communities. But that shouldn't stop us from imagining what an actual just democracy for all can look like in this country. Because if we do not imagine what that looks like, there is an entire other anti-democracy movement right now that is gaining steam across the country, that if they win, all the way from Congress down state houses, down to even running elections as county clerks, they will do everything in their power to make sure that my vision of what a just democracy for all looks like for my community will never come to fruition. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that, yes, people's disillusionments are coming from a real place, but we can't stop there. Too often, I think young people, when they are feeling like their votes don't matter, they don't view engaging in elections or voting as a valid way of advocacy. And I think as advocates, we have to recognize that voting isn't the only way to make change, right? We have to take to the streets. We have to go vote. We have to actually understand how elections are run and run our elections ourselves. That's another part. of the engagement process that we talk about in Generation Vote. But we cannot discount the importance of exercising the right to vote that many of us and many of our ancestors did not have in this country, and and take it from there.
Amara, what Bree is talking about, I think really speaks a lot to the work you do, especially around climate crisis, climate change, and this international conversation we're having. Could you talk a little bit about what it means to take to the streets when it's a global conversation? And if you'd like, talk a little bit about what channels you use and what you really use as inspiration to make sure that conversation is going.
Yeah, for sure. When I started this work when I was in high school, and my primary outlet was research. As I mentioned, I didn't have very many opportunities to explore my environmental passion when I was growing up. And I was so grateful in high school to find those. And I was the nerd. I was the kid in her basement doing my research project. And I loved it so much because it was the outlet I never had when I was growing up. I think it's really, really important, and I stress always to the youth that I work with, for you to have like two things. You really only need two things. You have to find your passion and you have to find your people, and then everything else is going to fall into place. I think a lot of the times, especially when it comes to this global crisis that's impacting all different parts of the world and is felt in all different parts of the world, it's very easy to get overwhelmed and anxious and have climate grief and climate anxiety. But one thing that everyone can do is know that they are passionate about the issue, find a community in which they know they're passionate about the issue with, and everything else, in terms of whether or not it's community service that they want to do. Maybe it's a policy change, declaring a climate crisis in your town or your city. There's a lot of things that one can do, and I think there's a lot of ideas that people have. However, it's very easy to get lost and just feel really overwhelmed if you're doing it on your own. This work is so much better with so many people in it. And I so believe in the power of collaboration, because that really is, at the end of the day, how we are going to make the change that we want to see. We can pass all the policies that we want, but if we don't have grassroots folks mobilizing around those policies, they just are not going to get passed. So I would just say, find your passion and find your people, and it'll be just a world changed.
I can't plus one that enough. And since we're doing this on camera and not on social media, for example, I can't plus one it, but it really brings up a topic that I think maybe in part because everyone on the panel has represented the youth voice in different ways. I think for those of us who are older, there is a temptation to go social media. That's going to be the panacea and the silver bullet for reaching these audiences. So I wanted to open this up to everyone on the panel to tell us what you really think the value of social media is, because I understand there's a diversity of opinions among us on the panel. But on top of that, I think this sort of idea of collectivism, which for those of us who are a little bit older might have called checkbook activism in the past, that there is this idea of taking one step, a transactional kind of signal versus a whole civic engagement journey or a lifetime relationship with trying to figure out how to turn your passion into actual purpose. I'm gonna throw it over to Bree, in part because so much of the work that you're talking about doing hits so many audiences, but especially when I think of AAPI communities and how much of a difference there is in this modern political moment about showing up in advocacy work.
Yeah, I love that question about social media. I think it's one that we're always grappling with as movement leaders. I think there's two parts of it. For Generation Vote, our whole organization's theory of change is movement driven. We believe that if we are going to see any sort of transformational change around democracy reform, let alone this concept of what would it look like to have a just democracy, we need to spark a movement. And some of the most successful movements in the country were sparked on social media, and even the ones happening now. In terms of the democracy world, I've always been fascinated, and I always keep an eye out on what's going on with the hashtag Milk Tea Alliance out in Asia, which is a national, it's a multinational movement in Asia led by young people fighting for democracy and reform in their countries, whether it be in Thailand or in Myanmar or in Hong Kong. And that movement was really woven together through social media and people using WeChat, for example, in the API community. That's a really popular way of organizing. And so I definitely think that social media has a really important role to play in terms of driving movements. When it comes to, though, engaging young voters, how can we ensure that the passion that we see on social media is translated to actual action, I think is a different question. And too often I see older candidates running for office assume that the only way they're going to reach young people is through social media only, because they see of how successful it's been in other spaces. But in the work that I do, quite frankly, most young people that I reach, I don't reach them through social media. It's through the old school deep canvassing tactics that the civil rights movement was doing, right? It was through having real conversations on campuses and in high schools and off campuses about why it's important to engage in our local community, canvassing, right? Out just going to community events and talking to young people. That's where a lot of our Get Out the Vote efforts have been successful. And that's what we're doing right now with our Gen Vote Ascenders program, is a combination of social media, but also don't discount the good old traditional grassroots tactics of deep canvassing and relational organizing. So I think you need both.
I can see everyone nodding enthusiastically. Sasha, so much of the work that you do is so intensely in real life. Could you talk about where you see this both going and where we are in the present tense, especially during this election cycle, in terms of social media being that channel that we have so much of a focus on when we talk about the youth vote?
I mean, I think it being a both and strategy, and we're thinking beyond the binary in general about it needing to bring all of the different audiences together, whether you're on different social media platforms. I think in movement building, there's different stages. So there's the education, and social media can be really helpful to break down complicated ideas and make them really accessible. But also, when we're talking about organizing, we're talking sometimes about reaching legislators and how many people can we get to not just retweet something on social media, but actually write their legislator. Maybe having it be a click-through email is a way to help build people's comfort with writing their legislator. But also then taking it one step further, the real engagement about getting people to call their legislator or have FaceTime with their legislator or show up to a rally is the next step on top of that we're looking to build up. But we don't always go from 0 to 100. Having it be a ramp where people can get familiar with different parts of talking about issues and showing up for activism is all part of the process. But I will definitely say, when I think about my big goal as a community organizer looking to support social movements and grow social movements, is that I do think we need to be protesting in the streets more. And there's the time for formal legislative conversation, but 10 years ago when I was in college and Occupy Wall Street was happening, for example, we were not going back to business as usual, and we were really seeing the stakes as high as they are and feeling like it was our personal responsibility to stop what we were doing and get involved. That's the kind of political culture that I'm hoping we can build. Like we're seeing in France, they're protesting as a whole country, all across the world. Other cultures and communities do have more of an affinity for protesting and disrupting the norm than I think we get comfortable doing here in the States. And so, especially in Boston, with a lot of the ivory towers that we see, it's important for us to check ourselves and make sure that we're really showing up in addition to social media.
I know we're coming up to questions, so I want to encourage everyone who's on this, please give us your questions. We have a bunch of experts who can really give you some strategic guidance and certainly some inspo. And I'm excited to get student questions as well. In part, Sasha, because you just mentioned audiences. And I'm curious in part because all four of you have used what I described as bureaucratic channels at different points. And as someone who's been embedded in LA City Hall, I know the power of public comment to really change a conversation. And I'm curious, how important do you think it is to motivate some of your audiences to show up? And Amara, I'm going to start with you in part because you're really nodding, and I know you have an amazing history of really making that work for getting your message out.
Yeah, for sure. The power of public comment can honestly not be overstated. My first time in which I guess, civically engaged with my school board and my town council, I was in high school. I'm from Maine, which I think has been mentioned. And in my high school, I was noticing just a culture around a lack of cultural competence and like awareness. And it was really a big disservice to the students of color at my school. So decided to form a club for students to actively share about their experiences at school. And after so much was stated, I decided to, with the backing of my community of this club, go to the school board and the town council to voice these concerns. After that, I was met with a one-time training on MLK Day. And they thought that that would be enough to address the deep-rooted concerns that these students and myself had. And it simply was just not enough. If I had not gone to my school board, I don't think that accountability would have been there. I went, it was documented, people knew that I went. Therefore, I had a way to hold the people who are, their job really is to serve their community. I had a way to hold them accountable. And so I would say, like, yes, social media and then also media outlets themselves are also a really powerful tool, because what I did was the students and we went to, I think it's the second largest news outlet in the state of Maine, the Bangor Daily News, and we shared our stories, and people heard, people listened. I outlined a set of demands for how to make a more culturally inclusive school environment. And we had over 6,000 signatures on that set of demands. And to this day, 2 years later, all of those demands have been actualized. And I'm so grateful that I took that first step. And although I was met with something that I was not hoping for, I had that accountability in place. And most recently in the work that I do, I was still am part of, as part of implementation, a legislative campaign for the legislative document 1902 here in Maine. This was signed into law by Governor Janet Mills this past May. Before this, I had done high school work with my city council and my school board. I had never been in a legislative campaign before, and it was a really amazing experience because when I was testifying, it was still over Zoom for the bill. One of the legislators, they unmuted and they said, "Hey, I'm going to be off video. I'm tending to my goats." And I said, wow, these are real people. Because I thought that legislators were just, yes, they were there, but they were these unreachable people. They were in suits and I think I had a single story about them. And I'm just like, this person has to go tend to their goats. They are like an actual person. And I think that that's something people need to remember. And so went through the legislative process with the bill and was so grateful for the grassroots space, specifically the youth grassroots space that we were able to build that led to passing a bill supporting climate education for all youth in the state of Maine, with over $2 million being allocated for that effort. I'm grateful for the experience that I had in high school that prepared me for this legislative process. And I think it's so important. Go to your town council. If you're in high school, go to your school board. They need to hear your voice because you have so many incredible things to say that can make the community better.
When you're talking about a state of 1 million people, that's an amazing impact. I know that we're getting ready for student questions. I also wanted to ask Enrique very quickly, how do you avoid these processes being bureaucratic boxes, like democratic voice? We just transcribed some public comments and we posted it on our site. There you go. How do we make sure that doesn't happen as we motivate people to actually show up and testify and make these public comments?
You know, we my department is actually the department that runs the community process for the zoning boards of Boston. Also the cannabis board and the licensing board. And what I encourage everyone, especially the youth, to realize is that your voice really does carry a lot of weight when we are having these community meetings, because all of those testimonies are sent to the boards. They're sent to the city council hearings. They're sent to the mayor's office. And the more pressure the elected officials get, the more they're gonna listen to you, because they're gonna realize it is something the community cares about, and it's not just something they're gonna be able to check off. Because at the end of the day, elected officials have a job to do. And if they don't do the job right, they know they won't get reelected. So I encourage everyone to please, as Amara just mentioned, go to your board meetings, go to your local civic association meetings. It doesn't have to be a city round meeting either. It could be your neighborhood associations, your neighborhood councils, your civic association meetings. All of these meetings have some sort of voting in place that are able to elevate your voice in a group manner and share that with the city. Before I worked here at City Hall, as the chair of the Latino Caucus for YDMA, I spent 2.5 years advocating for the driver's license bill here in Massachusetts. It would grant a license to undocumented residents. What I hope you realize from this is that it will be a long-term process, and you will feel burnout, because the experience of coming to speak and advocating and pushing for something you believe in is a long process. But it is one that, if you keep going and you do it in a manner that you're able to collaborate with others and bring attention to it, you will see results. And now that what we've been pushing for is now a question in the general election here in Massachusetts. I believe it's yes on 4. That's the campaign. And I can tell you that it was exhausting. It was tiring, but you do see end results. So please continue to be part of the community process, because it's not just another check in the box. It is something that matters.
I cannot applaud that more. I've worked on tools to make sure that public comment is something that we do something with, including on the local news level with the help of AI and low and no tech tools. So I'm thrilled that that's the conversation that's going on in city halls and beyond. I know we have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to start with a student, Max Foltz, who's doing his bachelor's in international relations. Max, please get on camera and give us a question.
Hi, everyone. I'm Max. And my question is going to be for Brianna Sia. So after you pursued your interests at the Brennan Center in the past, and now working for, or founding actually, Generation Vote, how do you think that issues such as gerrymandering and politically charged redistricting affect young people in the way that it causes us, like you said earlier, to vote less, being educated on all these issues now? I was wondering if you could elaborate on how that kind of, like I said, disenchants young people.
That's a great question, Maxwell. So you mentioned I was at the Brennan Center. So for context, I was the senior program and research and program associate at the Brennan Center on the redistricting and census team. So I was at the Brennan Center when the Supreme Court held that devastating ruling in Rucho v. Common Cause, which some of us gerrymandering nerds might remember. And it left basically a pretty big hole in the fight around partisan gerrymandering, right? They basically kicked it back to the states and basically allowed state legislators, gave them the freedom to be able to engage in partisan gerrymandering, which is a bad thing. So in terms of, since the Brennan Center, for when it comes to talking about how gerrymandering and more broadly this idea of voter suppression has impacted young people, at Generation Vote, we've held National Youth Listening Voting Rights Tour, where we travel the country virtually because of COVID, talking to young people from New Hampshire to Texas and Wisconsin, and we were seeing young people forced to jump over so many hurdles when trying to exercise their right to vote and participate in the political process. So whether that be having to wait on 6-hour lines because all the polling sites got stripped from their college campuses, or having to navigate restrictive voter ID laws that doesn't allow students because of residency rules to vote in certain states. And some of the other stories that we heard were efforts by legislators to target young Black and Brown voters through gerrymandering in the last redistricting cycle. And we saw that, I believe, at the North Carolina A&T University and Prairie View A&M. And so I raise all these stories because, gerrymandering and the fight over redistricting has directly impacted the right to vote for thousands of young people across the country. And after Rucho, it became even more clear that young people need to talk about the fight over redistricting just as much as we're talking about the fight over voting rights. And so in terms of what that meant for us, we were really involved in the fight around the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, which was the most expansive civil rights voting bill since the civil rights movement. And my team and I and dozens of young people from across the country were calling our legislators for that bill, because that bill would have banned partisan gerrymandering, as well as created independent redistricting, supported independent redistricting commission efforts across the country that would allow for more citizen-led redistricting efforts. And so we were calling our legislators, we were doing all sorts of advocacy campaigns, but it came to the point where we were fed up because we weren't seeing much movement in Congress around this bill. And so my team and I went to Washington, D.C. in January and joined a national hunger strike for democracy, where we didn't eat for a week. And we were urging the U.S. Senate to pass the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act by getting over the filibuster. And I put my body on the line because I truly believe that this bill was what we needed to stop those gerrymandering efforts that you're referring to show young people that this is a democratic crisis and we need to take it seriously, to Sasha's point earlier about taking to the streets. And so I have seen, since my time at Brennan, more and more young people recognizing overall the importance of addressing different aspects of how broken our democratic institutions are, from redistricting all the way to voting rights, and let alone the Supreme Court after Roe v. Wade. So I hope that answered your question, Maxwell, and I'm hoping to see more momentum around it after this redistricting cycle.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bree, I feel like that's the definition of good trouble, since you're invoking John Lewis in all of this. Prouget Con Williams, who's also an undergrad and has an amazing sounding multidisciplinary major in politics, philosophy, and economics, is up next to ask a question.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here. My question is for Enrique Pepin. I know transportation in a place like Boston has a lot of challenges. There's a lot of students, there's a lot of residents and businesses and tourists, and they all rely on our public transit system. And personally, I mean, I'm not sure young people understand the depth of importance that transportation has on our life. I mean, even personally, from going to school to work to dentist appointments or grocery shopping, we truly rely on being able to get places and get there on time. In what ways are you trying to reach our youth where they are at, to let them know there are opportunities and processes they can be involved in or aware of to make our commutes better and more timely? Thank you.
That is a great point. So I'm so thankful that you asked that question. As you can see, most recently with the Orange Line shutdown, people rely heavily on public transportation in Boston. Approximately 119,000 people take that train per day. That's a seventh of the population here in Boston, which is a lot, because there's only 700,000 people here. So when that happened, it allowed us, the city, to say and elevate the messaging of why is public transit so important? Why should we be focusing on ensuring that the city of Boston has proper transportation, not just with public transit, but with bicycle lanes, safer sidewalks, because walking is also has to be considered in a small city like Boston, and ensuring that it's safe. And when we were discussing that along with the BPDA, the Boston Planning Development Authority, the Boston Transportation Department, we decided that the best way to get youth engagement is by having community meetings in partnership with Spark Boston. Spark Boston is a group, it's a department here in the city where it is a representation of about 30 leaders that voluntarily participate that are between the ages of 18 to 35. And each of them represent a neighborhood in Boston. And they have been charged with finding and reaching out to youth groups in each neighborhood to make sure that they're part of the master plans behind the transportation plans here in the city of Boston. So that is one way that we've been doing it, because I think Bree touched upon this a few questions ago, where we can't depend on social media to reach the youth, because people are on social media for other things, and we can't have this stereotype where all youth aren't engaged on social media. We have to go to them. I've personally started going to schools to go speak to students as young as 5th graders, middle schoolers. Today I was at the O'Brien High School in Roxbury talking about neighborhood services and 311 resources that they have. So we have made it a priority under Mayor Wu's administration to go to them instead of just throwing information at them on Instagram or Twitter, because you won't get engagement that way. And transportation is, I've learned very quickly that it impacts everyone. It doesn't matter who you are. Transportation is the idea of getting from one location to the next. And if we don't include youth in that, we're failing. So if you have any ideas of how to continue youth engagement, I'd love to hear from you after the panel as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
As someone who's in LA, where traffic is a daily challenge, and our neighborhood council system is very strong, including transportation committees where we have teenagers representing their neighborhoods, I cannot applaud all of that more. Our next question is for Pop Demba Ka, who is really representing not only the graduate schools contingent here, but as a master's in global public policy, I think is bringing a perspective to the conversation that I really value. Please take it away with the question.
Thank you, Aparna. Thank you, everybody, for having me. And my question is for Sasha, a good friend. And I want to go back to the IAM bill as 2730 that we know have been passed by the Senate, but has yet to be brought to a vote in the House of Representatives. As we know from MassNow data, 56% of school nurses reported observing students missing class to obtain menstrual products. 25% of responding shelters reported that their shelter does not provide menstrual products. And I wanted to know, as the executive director of MassNow, could you please tell us the importance of the IAM bill besides providing access to menstrual products? And also, what impact can this issue have on youth political and social participation, especially for young girls? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, so MassNow introduced this bill, the IAM bill, for the first time in 2019. And since then, 15 other states around the country have passed period policy faster than we have here in Massachusetts, which is to say this is part of a national movement that is really youth-led, where states are seeing that they have an opportunity to ensure that menstrual products are considered public goods, just like toilet paper. In Massachusetts and in states and all around the country, we don't even know how much we spend on toilet paper because we just know it's a necessity. And it's a bipartisan issue, which is also really exciting. And so in the world of reproductive justice right now, where there's so many things that seem to be politicized for some reason when they shouldn't be, this is a really important way that we can move the needle on ensuring reproductive justice for the people who need it most. Because when people use menstrual products for too long because they don't have access to products, that creates reproductive health challenges down the line. So some of the things that we've been able to do here in Massachusetts, while we haven't passed the IAM bill yet is we have secured for the first time public funds in Massachusetts to provide free menstrual products, specifically through a project we're doing in Fall River, where we were able to partner with all the public schools in Fall River and 17 community organizations to provide free access to products. But in addition to the access is important. We're also here to spread menstruation education, because so many people don't know what is happening during menstruation. And I say people because I'm talking about menstruators. People who menstruate don't know what's happening to them. I've heard from so many people who got their period for the first time and thought they were dying. And it's not taught in our public schools. But also because people who don't menstruate also need to know what menstruation is too. I've talked to legislators who have never talked about periods before in their entire lives, even though they might be married and they might be twice as old as me or 3 times as old as me. And this is because in Massachusetts, we don't have health education that has been updated since before I was born. And I'm like, for 30 years, Massachusetts has not updated its health education. So we're also fighting to have health education be medically accurate. Like, that's a bar we need to set here in Massachusetts, one of the supposedly smartest states in the country. We still don't have that as a bar. Students are still being taught lies in schools. And also comprehensive. Comprehensive means LGBTQ inclusive. It means menstruation. And it also means consent, because that is something that we need to teach in public schools. And that is how we can proactively combat rape culture, which is, what leads to a lot more issues down the line too. So yeah, there's so many different webs that come from talking about periods, not just period products. And I'll say one last thing is that, in addition to schools, prisons, and shelters, which feel like the bare minimum, through doing this project in Fall River, we've learned that also the foster care system in Massachusetts does not reimburse for menstrual products. And that is a population that entirely needs free access to products, as well as the people who are using WIC or SNAP funds. That does not include menstrual products either. So there's really so much low-hanging fruit here, what I think is low-hanging fruit, that if we mobilize, if we, connect how many people listening right now have ever gotten their period without having a product or know someone, that is probably one of the most relatable things. If we could get everyone here to contact their state rep, that would definitely move the needle in having the bill brought to a vote.
That was such an important question, and I could see so many heads just nodding in unison. And this whole idea of making sure that the voices are represented, are heard by especially cis male legislators who might have daughters, wives, other female relatives, but are not having these conversations. The conversation that we're continuing now with some students includes Alexandra Zisa, who is minoring in Spanish and is majoring in biology, and she's got a question.
Hi, thanks so much, Aparna. As a young person pursuing a degree in science, I often notice that environmental and social justice challenges run quite parallel to each other in policy. So my question was for Amara. I was wondering if you would say that there's any room for overlap between the two, and further, how you would suggest that students like myself get involved in pursuing changes and activism in this policy.
Thank you so much for your question, Alexandra. Absolutely, there is an overlap. I mentioned earlier that I did research when I was in high school, and I was really passionate about research. I did environmental science research, actually. And I had a product, and I was like, wow, this actually works. That's interesting. I think I need people to maybe hear about this. So I went to my teacher, and they told me to go present at a symposium. And I did that. I said, okay, I presented at a symposium. What else can I do now? How can I actually tell my community about these problems that I'm noticing in my local watershed? It is a community issue. And I wasn't told what I could actually do. I had no idea what the outlets were to actually turning my research and like practice into actual policy solutions. That was a deep frustration that I felt when in high school. But I think that there's uh, definitely heading towards the right direction in ensuring that there's an intersectional approach to environmental science and policy and grassroots movements. There's degrees of environmental policy, which is amazing, so that folks are able to get that intersectional lens while they are still in school. That is why I chose the major that I did. I'm a political science and environmental studies major, and I'm able to have both of those viewpoints centered in my courses and the work that I do. And I would say, even if you are interested in either one or the other, so maybe a political science major, a politics major, or an environmental science, biology, chemistry major, that there's still so much potential in connecting with people who are not actually studying the same thing as you. There's so much power that comes from being in community with people with different perspectives and ideas than you, because that's really when solution generation is brought about. So I would highly encourage you to have a conversation with a political science major, have a conversation with a PPE major, and see what it is they're thinking about, because these issues are so intersectional in a way. It's not just the science folks that are going to solve the climate crisis. It's not just the policy folks that are going to mitigate our emissions. It's going to take a collective of individuals in order to do these things. I would also say it's incredibly important to start local and think about civic engagement as well. So when I was met with not a lot of clarity around how I could turn my research into actual policy, I decided that I wanted to do community science initiatives with some students at my high school. So monitoring my local watershed to ensure that it was safe for recreational use. That is something that I did that was actually having a really positive impact on my community. And it didn't just feel like I was producing data for the sake of producing data. I think it's also important to inform the public as well. So I had the opportunity to speak to one of my teachers. She had a nonprofit, and each year they would host kind of a symposium, and students could come and share about their research, share about community science efforts. I'd highly encourage you to just talk about the things that you're doing, because people want to hear about it. It's really cool. And it's also, if it's based in the community, impacting them as well. And lastly, there's a lot of power in grassroots movements as well. If you are noticing things in your town, specifically, and this might be like a perspective being from a place where my town council is very accessible. But if you're noticing things in your town, it's important to go and make a public comment, as we talked about earlier. I've seen a lot of success of students that I work with declaring climate emergencies in their towns and their districts, directly backed up by either research efforts that they led or just noticings that they were having in their community about things that were changing. So all in all, I think there's so many outlets for directly connecting environmental work to policy solutions.
Thank you so much, Amara. I mean, all of that is so incredible. The work that you do is really inspiring as someone who's, right behind you in age and in what I aspire to do. I just wanted to follow up with I was mentioning quickly what I did the other day. Professor Coolidge, who's also on the panel, I'm a student in her class, and she brought the entirety of our class to the Massachusetts State House to talk with some of the political figures there. Many of them were Suffolk alums. And, at the beginning of going, I had a very negative outlook on it, because I was like, I'm a science biology major. I have nothing to do with policy. And once I went there, not only did I get an interview with someone for, possible internship, but I saw what you were talking about with how important it is to have that intersection between, the science side and more of the policy side of environmental studies and activism. So I just wanted to say thank you again for reiterating that, because I'm almost 19 years old now, and that's something I quite literally just realized. So thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, because this energy, this momentum, and this insistence around this challenge we're all facing, but especially you, your generation, the panelists have to deal with the reality of this. This is not a far off into the distance conversation. This is about what we're doing right now. And speaking of what we're doing right now, I think the whole idea of convening conversations is such a compelling one. I think there's an anonymity sometimes that comes with the transactional piece of get out the vote. It's very much register, go to the ballot boxes, mail in your ballot, whatever it is. The ongoing conversation that we have between elections that really strengthens not only our ability to speak to what constituents care about, what our neighbors are going to show up for, but also what do legislators have to care about? What is the policy implication of me showing up and saying, I'm voting for this? So I'm going to start with Bree in terms of talking about who do you look to? Who are the partners? Who are the individuals that really inspire you and light a fire under you to continue doing your work?
Yeah, well, for all you Massachusetts folks, I'm a huge fan of Representative Presley.
Yes.
Yeah, she's amazing. Some of you may not know this. I mean, she sponsors a lot of legislation and so championed many issues. But one of the things that Presley has championed was a lower the voting age bill with Congresswoman Grace Meng, who's actually one of my congressperson back in my home state of New York. And when I saw Presley and Meng partner together on bringing forth legislation, a constitutional amendment to lower the voting age to 16 for federal elections, I was like, that is the conversations we need to be having in the democracy space, right? Sure, it's important to fight for things like the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, which is just setting the basic common sense minimum of what voting should look like in our states that makes it accessible for people of color and all Americans to be able to vote. But what we're trying to do at Generation Vote, and to your question of other orgs to look to, truly, Generation Vote, I think, is the organization in the space around voting rights and youth voting rights that I think is bringing that same energy of let's have a real conversation around what does it look like to have a just democracy for all. And that includes lower the voting ages for 16-year-olds, right? Who, 16-year-olds, we're going to be in the world that may or may not be burning in 10, 20 years, right? We should have a say in our future. And so definitely a huge fan of Presley. And in terms of organizations, if y'all are interested in learning more about this narrative and the fight and that energy that we're trying to bring in Generation Vote to the broader democracy space, you can check us out at genvote.org or at GenVoteUS. We are working with young people across the country to start teams and hubs at your schools, in your communities, to support this what it would look like to have a just democracy for all in your community. Go President.
What do you think, Enrique, as someone who is both representing the inside City Hall perspective that has obviously worked tirelessly to make sure that people who are elected represent all of us?
Not because she's my boss, but Mayor Michelle Wu really does exemplify courageous leadership. Throughout the hate that she has received since the beginning of her administration, the negativity that she's had to face, she stayed courageous. And it's amazing to be in meetings with her because no matter what she's being attacked on, she knows what she wants to be able to accomplish, whether it's building transitional housing to help the homeless community in a neighborhood that doesn't want it because of the stigma, or making sure that we're building safe transportation option in a place that doesn't want bike lanes. But it's about that bigger picture. And that's inspired me because sometimes if you let the negativity get to you, you won't implement change. And you have to be courageous. And that's what I've been learning from Mayor Wu. And then just because I've been very much involved with the community, I would also say it's those community leaders who don't get paid to do any of this, who certainly don't have a lot of time to do it, but they step up and they are the voices for the leaders. I was meeting with the Cape Verdean Association of Boston. There's this gentleman that He's been doing this work for like 20 years. And he just makes sure that they're taken care of and that he's holding us accountable here in the city. And that's another that's another group in the community that I look up to. So yeah, those two definitely stand out to me.
Sasha, where do you find courageous leadership?
Well, the first person that comes to mind is my friend from college, current Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has a really good perspective with everything that's super overwhelming, I think. It's hard to focus. It's hard to figure out where to focus when there's so much hate that we're seeing on the rise. And yet also we know there's a lot of solutions that work. And in Massachusetts, what I'm excited about is being able to scale up those solutions that already work. So scale up the cities and towns that are already doing free period product access and doing menstrual health and sex education in schools and implementing childcare that is affordable and accessible in communities. I know we know how to do this on the local level, and it's just a matter of scaling it up. In terms of, how folks can get involved on the organizational level here in Massachusetts, join Mass Now. We are a youth-led intergenerational community with thousands of members across the state. Most of our organizing is online now, but you happen to be in the center of it all if you're at Suffolk near the State House. And we're advocating for over 40 different bills on our legislative agenda. So you can join an upcoming chapter meeting. We have one Monday night at 6 p.m. to meet other members and check out the Period Art Show, check out our organizing groups on our website, and get to know other people, because it's not just it's election day up and down the ballot, and it's also all the time in between in order to hold our elected officials accountable. So there's something for everyone.
Mara, I think given I'm already inspired by the work you do and the courage, especially as the youngest member of our panel, could you quickly tell us who you're looking to and who we should all follow in whatever sense?
Yes, I would highly encourage everyone to check out Vic Barrett. I had such an honor of meeting Vic in person. He was the keynote for an environmental gathering that I attended. I think I was 16 back then. But seeing Vic and hearing from Vic taught me two things. One, as a Black woman in this work, that I belong in the climate movement, I belong in the environmental movement, and it's so important to center the stories of Black and Brown folks who are the most impacted by environmental concerns. And two, my story is power. And there's a lot of power in sharing what my personal experiences with environmental harm are. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to connect with Vic, to follow his work. He's one of the 21 youth suing the United States government for knowingly harming youth in our future when it comes to environmental concerns. That's the Juliana versus the US Supreme Court case. So that is who I'm and just encourage you all to check out.
Great. And I know Bree has to jump off shortly. So Bree, please tell us quickly, what are you thinking of when I say courageous leadership and who you're looking to for inspiration and impact?
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for having me. I think I shared earlier that Presley was the person I recommended everyone check out. I have plenty, though, of personal heroes and sheroes. So if anyone is interested in learning more, you can definitely feel free to reach out. And again, thanks so much. I have another commitment happening now. So I'll see y'all off Zoom.
Thank you so much, Bree. In terms of what the takeaways are, I know that this is being recorded. While I was not actively taking notes, obviously moderating, I'm looking forward to going back and pulling out and extracting the really valuable insights this panel has brought to us today and tweeting the hell out of it. You can tell I'm an old head because I still rely on Twitter as well as Instagram sometimes, not as much on the stories, but I'm sure the panelists will be open to responding to the questions that you didn't come up with in the moment afterwards on Twitter.
Thank you, Aparna, and thank you to all of our amazing panelists, and especially to our amazing students and alum who joined us here today. I think this conversation could go on for a really long time, and I hope you'll join us for future episodes so that we're not getting, I mean, this wasn't a 30-second soundbite. It was an hour and a quarter deep conversation, but I think we barely scratched the surface. You've been talking about the amazing ways that young folks are engaged and active. My question to you is, how do you think this will translate into turnout and votes in the midterms?
Maine is a purple state, and we have a governor's election this T minus, like 3 weeks. I'm seeing so much, specifically on social media, incredible youth activists who are just compelling their friends, your vote really, really does matter. Especially in a state that there's only 1 million people to begin with. Your vote, it matters a lot. So I think that it will just turn out to be just another really awesome year for voter turnout. I'm really grateful that the first year I could vote was the most recent presidential election. And it was really awesome to see what the power of voting could do. And I know that the power of voting again and the youth turnout specifically is something that is going to lend so well during this midterm election.
Anyone can jump in.
Sure, I guess I can go. Here in Massachusetts, we're about to have the elections to elect our next governor and state auditor and a ton of state senators and you name it. And what I would have to say is that this is a moment where the youth should take advantage of it, because whenever we get the chance to elect the governor, we get an opportunity to set the rhythm for the state for such and such many years in the future, especially going from potentially one party to the other, depending on what you believe in. And I encourage you all to go out and vote, because your voice does matter. As much as you may think or sometimes doubt that your voice does not matter, but numbers count in elections, and you may think that way and others people may think that way. So it may not be enough. So I encourage you guys to go vote in November, because that's the only way that you'll be able to implement change and being part of that community process and continue to have your voice be elevated. But I'm always a sucker for elections, and I always make sure people go out to vote. So I encourage you to do so.
I'm going to jump in as someone who's looking at this from the outsider perspective, in the sense of not being considered in the youth generation vote block. And I know from helping run our civic youth program, among other projects where we had the largest convening of deliberative democracy around what a conservation corps might look like under the Biden administration, for example. Coming of age as an activist feels like it's embedded in your generations in a way that it wasn't as Gen X, kind of known as the slacker generation. If you don't show up, whether you're an influencer who isn't necessarily political, without a viewpoint, you're less relevant. And I think that part where the conversation is very present, and the fact that all of you are channeling those conversations and turning that into action, is where I'm feeling the momentum and that energy that you're bringing. So thank you again for turning that inspiration into impact and offering your peers the tools to make it happen. I'm optimistic. I'm also the person who's never been an election prognosticator for a reason.
Sasha, do you have a quick comment? Because I'm in trouble for extending this.
No, I guess I'll just say I think that young people are coming out to vote also, like according to exit polls. I just want to give I think props to young people for coming out, but also say that even here in Massachusetts, we have anti-choice, anti-abortion people running for office against people who have been progressive champions here in Massachusetts in the state house. So we can't take for granted that we don't have those elections happening here right in our own backyard also, that we need to be paying attention to. So you can head to the Mass Now PAC section of our website to see which campaigns we're focusing on to make sure if, beyond your vote, how you can mobilize voting.
Thank you all. Have a good night.